This week on Jared Scott Outdoors, we're heading out after deer. We both actually have buck tags. Late season, we're looking at November 25th to December 9th. So quite a late hunt in a unit that I have never hunted deer before during the season. It's not a unit that's known for deer, so I'm not quite sure. I put in just to kind of explore some new stuff. We've got Kim. You have never seen Kim before.
No.
A friend that I have, and we got talking hunting, and I was like, yeah, let's go
do it.
Let's go do some hunting. So anyways, we are after mule deer bucks, and we're hoping to get a big one. I don't know, it's been 20 years since this guy has hunted.
1999.
1999. What are you looking for?
Antlers, big ones.
Big antlers.
And flat ground.
There isn't any flat ground.
No, there's
here,
no flat ground up here.
All
He's
right.
right.
Let's get after it.
All right.
Welcome to Jared Scott Outdoors, your source in the field for local outdoor news. As I mentioned, this was a muzzleloader hunt with Kim and I. However, the first day out was just me with my son Cade. We headed out for the opening morning while Kim was going to join me the following day. Just driving along the road that opening morning, we spotted a buck 100 yards up the hill. Driving around the corner to get out of sight, we hopped out and got our gear together. While doing that, some other hunters drove by. What we didn't know is that as they drove by, a hunter jumped out of the truck, and we got back inside of the buck just in time to watch them shoot it. It was a youth that harvested the buck, and we were happy for him. We had spotted other deer further up the canyon, so we just headed on up the road to go get a better look at them. We watched several does, but didn't end up finding anything with antlers. Back in the truck, we headed further on up the road. So far, we were pretty happy with all the deer we'd seen in such a short time. Spotting some deer across a small canyon, right off the bat, you could see antlers. We hopped out and pulled out the spotting scope. Sure enough, there was a pretty nice buck. A solid buck. It had nice uniform and dark antlers. It wasn't a giant, but it was a good-looking buck worth consideration. We couldn't do anything where we were, and the deer were on the move, so we just held tight watching them, and of course, specifically watching that buck. The more I watched it, the more I liked it. It was just a good-looking buck. As they climbed higher and higher, they eventually got into a little patch of scrub brush that was probably where they would end up bedding up. Knowing that, and knowing that these deer were in full view of any other hunters that came driving this road behind us, we figured it was time to get moving. We drove up the road about a half mile so we'd be out of sight. Out of sight, out of mind is what we were hoping.
Well, as you saw, we spotted that younger 4-point buck there right at first light. We went around the road and parked and getting our stuff together, and some other hunters passed by. We figured they'd probably seen it but didn't know what they were doing. When we walked out, we saw they had dropped off a couple hunters and watched them shoot that buck. So that was actually kind of fun to see that. But anyways, we've come up a few more miles, spotted a handful of other deer, but in this one particular group, you saw a pretty nice 4-point. It's not huge, but it's nice. I really think I'd probably regret it if I passed on it. So I think we're going to head on over and most likely see if we can get in on it. So it's on a big open face. There's not a lot we can do, and so we drove past it, quite a ways past it, into some trees so that we're hidden as far as it seeing the truck. And you know, it's probably about 3/4 of a mile away, maybe half a mile, but we've got to drop down about 500 feet and then climb up another 800 feet or something, see if we can get in position. So there's still a lot of work to be had to see if we can even get in on this buck, but looks like a pretty buck.
We had a very deep canyon between us and the buck to drop down into and then hike back up. So even though they weren't too far off, we actually had a lot of work to do to get into range. Before we dropped down into this deep canyon, we took a quick look to see that yes, the deer were still where we left them, and then we dropped down.
This is going to be a tough hike. But it looks like we got to this point without spooking them, so that's good.
Like so many places we hunt and so many places deer hang out, this was steep country. Very steep country. Luckily, we had a game trail to follow for part of it, and we covered ground rather quickly. Cade was a trooper and was able to keep right up with me. I had already loaded the gun with powder and bullet, but now we were close enough it was time to put the cap on. I also switched my darker beanie for my white colored one, as I'd probably be peeking over the top and skylined. A white beanie would blend into the sky much better than my regular camo. Getting close, I inched my way over so I could be careful not to get caught if they were out in the open. I didn't see any of the deer to my left, but in looking to my right, I suddenly saw a dozen deer bedded up a long ways off. At first I thought it was the same deer we were after, but I quickly realized they couldn't be the same ones. I couldn't see a buck in the mix either, so we'd ignore them for now and keep sneaking in where those others should be. Well, we crept in, but just couldn't find any deer. They had disappeared. Just to make sure we weren't missing them, I snuck around and made sure to check each spot that I couldn't see clearly in, just in case they were bedded up and out of sight. But no, they were gone.
Well, they're gone. All we can guess is that we ended up having those trucks from that other group of hunters that shot that buck. They kind of kept coming up this way after we were trying to do our sneak when we were on the back side, so they must have had another hunter, and I'm guessing they saw the deer and stopped right across the canyon and glassed them and probably bumped them out. So now we got to just try to guess where. So we'll just do some hiking around, see if we can find them again. That's too bad. They were in a good spot.
I didn't think they'd be too far off, and so we made an educated guess on where they'd probably have gone and headed that way. Of course, just as it started snowing on us, the deer appeared out in front of us. However, a couple does had already spotted us and were acting like they were gonna bust. Ranging those closer does, they were at 130 yards. The buck was hot after a doe and didn't seem to notice us, so I quickly set up. Cade, who was running the camera, had a hard time finding that buck in the viewfinder because of all the snow and ended up focusing on a couple does while I was sighting in on the buck, which was off the screen.
Well, that was my first shot at a big game animal with a muzzleloader, and it was a big miss. So it's about 130 yards, a little bit further than I was hoping, but we had a doe that had me pegged and just decided to go for it, and I missed it. So we have since watched them go up over the next ridge. We're trying to decide if we go follow and try to find them again.
After my miss, we tried to find the buck again, but couldn't. We did find a group of other does, and then later we headed to that big group of deer we'd seen earlier in the morning. When we found them, we were surprised to see another decent 4-point with them. It wasn't as big as that last one I missed, and was quite a bit younger and spindlier, so I opted to pass on trying to get in on it for now. Maybe later, but not today. Overall, we had a good day. It left me thinking there was a good chance we could make something happen when Kim would join me the next morning. So early the next morning, Kim and I were out checking out some other canyons in the area. We went to a high point where we could glass up a lot of country. We got there about first light and were excited to see what would show up. I was actually surprised that we could only find a handful of deer. In the miles and miles of country we could see, we only found this one group of muleys. We did finally spot one buck in the group, but it was only a little forky. We kept an eye out and did watch as several more deer materialized with that group, but no other bucks. Without finding anything worth going after, we ended up heading back to that same area Cade and I had seen those 2 bucks the day before. We had spotted some deer up high in a draw that was tough to see into, so we just hiked up to have a better look.
Back out the next day, Cade stayed home, and I brought out my friend Kim, who you can see behind me, who also has this tag. So now there's 2 of us. We've done a lot of spotting in the morning, checking stuff out, and decided just to come back where we saw those bucks yesterday. So we're just about to pop over and see if we can find them. They're kind of in a little draw that's hidden from view, so you got to do a bit of hike to get to them. So
it turned out there were a lot of deer in this draw above us, but try as we couldn't find a single buck. Nearly 20 does scattered around and no bucks. This time of year being the tail end of the rut, that just didn't make sense, unless there was another group of does that had the attention of all the nearby bucks. I knew from yesterday that there were at least 2 4-point bucks on this mountain somewhere. We were just missing something. So instead of heading back off the mountain, we decided to keep going. There was a draw a half-mile ahead where Cade and I had seen other deer as well as a small buck. Maybe that would be worth looking into.
we're finding lots and lots of does, just can't find any bucks.
Well, once we made it to the new drainage, there were no deer in sight, but I was looking in the wrong spot. As I glanced above us, I spotted a doe feeding over the ridge right towards us. Then another doe appeared. As we watched where they were headed and moved forward more so we could see more of the draw in front of us, we spotted a buck. It was the younger looking 4-point Cade and I had seen the previous day. Kim and I snuck in as close as we could without getting caught and settled in. They were working our way, so we just hang tight and see what happened. As we watched, a few more deer appeared, out of nowhere it seemed, and wouldn't you know it, but that bigger 4-point buck was one of them. This was just getting better and better. 2 4-point bucks with a handful of does, and they were all feeding our direction.
The buck I shot at. We just need him to feed across this other side.
As it was, they were still about 400 yards off, so they needed to come in a lot more. We had no cover to use between us and them to get any closer, so all we could do was wait. We did have one issue. With these shorter winter days, it was already late in the afternoon, and we probably only had about an hour and a half of shooting light left. When a doe looked down below us and seemed to really be staring something down hard, we looked that way as well. Turned out the smaller buck Cade and I had spotted yesterday but didn't film was also there. It was a small 3-point buck. Suddenly I realized we had all the bucks that I knew of in this one draw. There was obviously a doe in heat here that had all their attention. We waited for some time just watching and biding our time. They were getting closer and closer with the front does heading right towards us. This could work out perfectly. After more waiting, suddenly that small buck and a doe got nervous about something below us in the trees. We couldn't see anything, and they didn't really seem to be looking at us, but they sure got all the other deer on edge for a bit and even started moving away from us.
The other one got up.
Eventually, they settled down and went back to feeding like nothing had happened. But now, instead of feeding our way, they were staying above us in a direction that would keep them out of range. Behind us, the sun was now setting. We were now down to less than a half hour of shooting light, and these deer were obviously not going to come our way in that time. We had to make something happen. Looking over all our options, the only option we had was to try to back up, get out of sight, and then climb up higher and hope we had some terrain that would allow us to get in range. It didn't look very promising, but we had to try. Going up as fast as we could get our tired legs to go, we finally got up to their elevation with just about 10 minutes of shooting light. There were some big rock outcroppings that we could use to sneak in closer, so hopefully that would put us in range. Getting there, we were disappointed to range the deer still at 200 yards. That was so frustrating. As we tried to get a little closer with no cover to work with, it was the small buck that caught us. It put all the others on alert, and then they all started heading over the ridge in a hurry. The last couple hours of watching 2 nice bucks and getting all excited just ended watching them head on out of sight.
All right, so we saw some antlers finally. We got those couple 4-points and just ran out of daylight, as you saw. They were more like antelope, just staying out in the wide open country. And nothing we could do about it. And running out of daylight, we had to try to make something happen. We got to within about 200 yards, and that little 3-point caught us and got everything on high alert, and then they all took off. And anyways, what do you think, Kim? First day back after 20-year hiatus of hunting.
Hey, I'm ready tomorrow. Let's do it. Well, maybe not tomorrow, but
We'll be back.
we're not done.
We'll be back.
Well, we went out about a week later. We figured that maybe given a week's worth of time would allow more bucks to come out of the woodwork to check out all these does we'd been seeing. Heading back to that same high point we hit the week prior, it was slim pickings. After some time, we finally spotted a few deer bedded up in some trees a ways off. We had to wait quite a while before they finally started working their way out. As they did, we noticed a little buck, but that was it. About a half hour later, another buck materialized following a doe out of those trees. This buck was a 4-point and did get us excited for a moment, but a closer look revealed it was just a very small 4-point, really a glorified 2-point. It was hard to talk ourselves into hiking all the way to it in the now deeper snow for a chance at such a young buck. So we called it and headed off to try to glass up those other 4-points we'd seen the week before. We did find a lot of those does, but just couldn't find any bucks. After all this time hiking around and working so hard to find a buck, wouldn't you know it, but as we were driving out, some deer crossed the road right in front of us, and of course, there was a buck with them. It was another 4-point, but a young one. However, being so easy to get to, Kim decided he'd give it a try if it would hold tight. So hopping out and getting off the road a bit, the deer actually didn't take off too fast and gave Kim an opportunity.
He's the top one now. He's going to be the top one, almost. All right, he's walking up to the top. There's deer in the way.
This was Kim's chance. Yep, that was a misfire, one of those frustrating things that can happen so often with a muzzleloader. After the buck was out of sight, he replaced the cap and fired it to clear the gun, but again, just the cap went off. Suspecting a plug nipple, he replaced it, and sure enough, it then fired. As you can see, we're out of time, but we did get into more action, and Kim's gun didn't misfire, and his aim was also true. Tune in next week at the same time for another episode of Jared Scott Outdoors.